awesome folks, it is Friday, and that means it is time for another episode of Stealing the Spotlight with yours truly, the Rogue Lady. So let's get into today's video. Okay, so on today's video, I'm going to talk about the age-old struggle of combat in D&D. As we all know, combat in D&D can be quite a slog sometimes, especially if you're not prepared for it. So I've compiled a list of methods and techniques and ideas that I use at my table to make combat a little more fun, a little more fast-paced, and a little more interesting for my players. So let's get started on that list. Alright, so in this list, it's no particular order, it's just like whatever came out of my head when it did when I was taking my notes, so bear with me through that, alright? First thing on my list is one that a lot of people mention, so I'm just going to go through it really fast, and that is crunchy criticals. When your player hits a d20 and they get like a nat 20 on that, and it's a critical, what I like to do is just give them max damage on the weapon attack roll, plus add whatever modifiers they had, and then let them roll a second time, and maybe even let them roll that second time with advantage, so they get as much damage as they can without going too crazy with it. But yeah, max damage on the weapon, plus the modifiers, plus a second roll, and allow them to add all of that together for that juicy critical, crunchy critical hit. The second thing on my list was having mobs go all at one time. So if you have like a boss monster and they've got mobs, which they're gonna need mobs to slow the fight down at least a little bit, so your players don't just like gang up on the boss and destroy it, and then there's nothing fun, no exciting like close call. So you have your mob creatures all going at one time. So when you roll initiative, what I'll do is I'll stick my mobs either randomly in the initiative where I think makes sense, or I will roll initiative for them and put them in there just like everybody else, but they will all have one initiative. So I found that whenever I had my mobs like scattered out through the initiative, it was harder for me to keep track of everything, even though it was right there in front of me, and it felt like it took forever for each player's turn to come around, and people started to like get a little bored, like waiting around for their turn, and also it was just like so many things for me to keep track of. And as we all know, as a DM, as a GM, we have way too much to keep track of anyway, so you want to simplify things for yourself, especially even if the players don't see that it's more simplified. If it's simplified for you, it will make you a better DM because it will allow you to move on to the next thing quicker. So I just have all of my mobs go at the same time. I also noticed that my players got a little more like on edge when every single mob like moves towards them at the same time, or like they're all like closing in on the players, and they really like that feeling of like the enemies are closing in on us. So that's another reason why I like to let all the mobs go at once. And if they all have like bows, right? Like if there's a bunch of goblins and they all have like arrows, it's like a volley of arrows comes at my players. So as long as you don't like just straight up kill them and TPK them from the volley of arrows, just having those arrows flying at them from everywhere all at one time, it's very spicy and very nice. So the third thing on my list is having NPCs engage with enemies either without a roll or with a very simple roll. So in initiative, when one of my NPCs is engaged with a mob, which is usually what I have the NPCs doing to like help thin out the mobs, is have both of their turns go at the exact same time, and then I'll roll a die behind the DM screen, and I'll decide even the NPC will get the upper hand, odd the mob will get the upper hand, and then I'll just briefly describe that exchange of combat, either really quickly, or if it's a little more important, especially if the enemy is getting the upper hand, I'll describe that so that the players know, okay, they're over there fighting, see them in the corner of my eye, this is what I pick up from that. So just really brief, speeds things up a bit, and you don't have to worry about numbers. If you want to, you can keep track of their HP, but really what I'll do is I'll just like pay attention to the room, read the room. If my players are wiping out the enemies really easy, maybe my NPC does the same, and so on. But yeah, just speeding that up a bit will help to get back to what's important, which is the players getting to take their turns. The fourth thing on my list is filling the room with things to do. I love to have levers and platforms and locations for cover and chandeliers to swing off of, chains holding enemies up, all sorts of things like that around the room to encourage my players to do something else other than just move in and roll dice till the numbers go down. That ends up being kind of boring. And I put a lot of effort into designing my maps and things, and so when the players just run up and the NPC and the creature just locked into them, and then a few rounds go by and it's dead and no one got to explore the room, it feels like I wasted my time creating the map, and also it doesn't feel very fulfilling for the players. So I like to encourage them to move around the room. I like to give my enemies ways to move around the room. I'll give an example. The last big boss that my characters fought was a queen of the mycelia, and they were in a cavern that was full of mushroom spores and mushrooms everywhere, and there were these clusters of mushrooms spread out in the room. The queen is actually able to go down into those clusters and come out at any of the other fixed locations in the room. Every time they were starting to get her low, she would do that. So they would start to get frustrated with that, and they ended up finding out that the mushrooms are highly flammable. They've actually known this for a few sessions, so they started burning the different locations that she could come out of, which was cutting her off from going through those, and if she did come up out of them, she would take extra damage from the fire. So things like that, allowing my queen to move around, allowing my boss to move around, which makes my players chase her around, makes them rechange what they're doing, keeps them from locking into the one spot, and also encourages them to think out of the box, encourages them to do something different. Another one was that I had two creatures that seemingly were the same. It was actually two, but they didn't know it, and they were on chains, but the chains were hidden from the players because they were all tripping on mushrooms, right? So when the enemy would start to take damage, it would fly up into the air and then come down behind them and attack them from another angle. And at first they thought it was something teleporting, but after some time and some good perception rolls, they started realizing that they were on chains and there was actually two of them. So being creative like that made the players start to think and start to look around the room and try and find ways to solve this. So they found a lever that was controlling the chains, while another one was just straight up attacking the chains once they discovered that they were there. And it became a really fun puzzle inside of the combat. So sticking puzzles and things to do in the room inside of combat is awesome and is going to really make things more fun for everybody. If you're finding that your players are having trouble realizing that they can do that, especially if they're new players, like if they don't know that they can do something aside from just stab, roll dice, is have the NPCs or the creatures doing it. So if you're having a bar fight and you don't want them to get, like, you don't want to get them murdery, but you want them to have to fight their way out, have an NPC break a bottle and hit somebody with it. Have someone flip a table. Have someone grab the chair. Have someone swing across the chandelier. Like, describe to your players that it can be done by showing it to them instead of just telling them, right? And when your players start getting creative like that, start trying to swing from chandeliers, either give them like an automatic success or give them advantage on their rolls for being creative. We want to reward our players for role playing. We want to reward them for thinking outside the box. And it may be that they start doing that and they start keeping you on your toes, which is great because part of D&D is having this like awesome mind exercise where you get creative and you get to like yes and each other and tell this great story. So knowing that the more you push your players to be creative, the more creative you're going to have to be is super important as well. Alright, so the fifth thing on my list is allowing my players to target specific parts of enemies. One of my favorite things to do in a boss fight is to have a boss that's very strong at first, but has weak points that they can attack. And I know that in D&D, it's not very often that a character or a creature's like stat block will come with weak points. So you just kind of have to like make them yourself a lot of times. There are some resources out there for stuff like that, but I just like to wing it and think about video games. Pull from video games, because we all play video games, right? Many of us nerds do, at least. And one of the things that we get in those fights is when we're fighting something big and scary, there'll be like a weak point highlighted somewhere. We have to go attack that. Obviously, I'm not gonna like highlight the weak point necessarily, but hint towards it. When they are rolling their perception checks or when they're fighting or they're getting up close, describe that the weak point is there when they miss or when they succeed. For instance, if an enemy is heavily armored but they have some weak points in the joints, draw attention to the joints when you're describing the armor you see massive silver plates of armor with leather or chain in between. You just like linger a little bit on those weak points to like encourage them to do that. Or if you have a creature with multiple heads, when a character lands a good hit or they land a medium hit and the creature tries to deflect it but isn't able to, they accidentally deflect the attack into their own weak point. So you can draw attention that way instead of just being like, oh yeah, here's the weak point like they do in video games. Hint to it. So have them accidentally discovering, or if they're rolling high perception, like a rogue is over there like sniping, you can just straight up tell them. But or at least be like, you see this weak point, right? So number 6, which is actually kind of a continuation of number 5, and that is allow players to break enemies' armor, break their shields, their weapons, and so on. So if an enemy has a heavy armor, but they start to attack these weak points, or they like attack the same spot over and over again, or they just land big hits, you have those armor plates start to fall off. You have pieces of the enemy start to fall off, and their AC will then start to drop. I'll do it just like 1 point at a time, or if it's a real big hit, maybe 2 points. But the players are always trying to figure out what the AC of a monster is, especially at the beginning. You can straight up tell them if you want, but what I like to do is not tell them, and then once they start getting it, once they start hitting it, they're like, okay, I need to make at least this number, right? And then all of a sudden a piece falls off, and they roll, and they're like, damn, that was one number too short. Then they get a hit anyway, and they're like, oh, wait, I thought the AC was that, right? And they start to like conversate with each other, like, oh, I think we're weakening it. Oh, I think it's more vulnerable now. Right? So you allow them to break pieces off of the monster. If there's a creature or a baddie with a big shield, and that big shield is tanking everything, and they start to hit, and they're hitting that shield super hard, you can have the shield start to crack. You can have pieces of the shield start to fall off. You can have them like grab the shield and like try and wrestle it away from the enemy. Have one of the players literally spend their entire turn just holding on to that shield to keep the enemy from being able to use it again to block the next attack, and then dramatically drop their AC just for that time. The other player is like distracting them by holding on to the shield. Encourage your players to get creative like that, and they're going to have so much more fun in combat, even if combat still takes longer than you want it to. Alright, so my 7th tip is curate a good playlist for the fights. I like to have my monsters have a theme song. I like to have my big bads have a theme song that I will hint to throughout discussions of the character. Like if my players are like having a meeting about the big bad before they actually go fight him, I'll have that song just playing in the background, even if it's really subtle, and turn down the volume. If I'm describing the big bad, like what I like, one of the things I like to do is like describe what's going on in the enemy's side of things randomly at the beginning of a session. Maybe I'll be like, all right, well, elsewhere in the world this is going on, and like I'll keep it kind of vague, but while I'm describing it, that theme song will be playing. So when the time comes that they actually fight them, that theme song starts at the beginning of the combat, or before they even walk in the room with them, or right when they're about to walk in the room with them, or right when the monster's about to show up on them, the song will start to play. Having them trained to react to that song, or to know that that's going to be the like boss music, is super choice. And then just creating a whole playlist around that character or that type of enemy that plays when they fight them, and that will get your players in the right headspace. And having a good action soundtrack is always great for combat because it keeps the pace up, it keeps them pumped. We love music as human beings. It makes us like feel and move, and so when you have those good playlists going, that's going to make combat even more fun and even more interactive and even more like bring your players into the moment. So in the vein of simple things, the next one is reminding your players that it's their turn next. I know that's not much, but it's a big one, because if your players don't remember it's their turn next, they're not going to be looking at their character sheet, they're not going to be like prepping their spells or like their ideas or whatever. So at the beginning of the turn before theirs, be like, okay, this is player B's turn, player C, you're up next. Make sure you look at them, make sure they look at you and acknowledge that it's their turn next. That way they can be listening to what's happening and planning what they're going to do. I know that's a simple one, but that one was really good for me and my table. Because we have a few players. I had one player for a long time who is not with us anymore, sadly, but they had a lot of ADHD and would totally forget that things were even happening, and so reminding them that it was their turn next. And they were also new to D&D, by the way, so reminding them that it was their turn next gave them a chance to like be here now and prepare for their turn. So really simple. I don't even know what number we're on anymore. So the next one, I think it's 8 maybe. But for the next one, it is encouraging teamwork with your players. I know that one's also pretty simple, or a vague concept, and like also just the name of the game. But if you encourage your players to work together to overcome obstacles, they're going to be more engaged in combat, and they're going to be thinking outside the box and being creative. Having players have complementary skills prepared, have complementary ideas prepared, encourage them to come up with creative solutions like giving each other a boost for movement or things like that. And I know that there are a lot of builds that are specifically for buffing other players and other party members, so of course having one of those on your team is always good, but you don't get to always choose. But if you don't have one, have an NPC involved in the party that does do that, and have them verbally reminding the other players to work together. And if you do that enough, they'll start to like do it on their own. They'll start to remember to work together. So yeah, things like that. It takes me back to one of my other points where I was talking about having one player hold on to the enemy's shield or hold on to the enemy's weapon while the others close in. So you could have your NPC go do that. You have your NPC get in the way and try and like stop the enemy from attacking for a minute. Just small little things to encourage teamwork. Another one on my list, which I probably touched on briefly as well during one of the other examples, was just putting your enemies in out of reach areas at the start of the combat. That way your players don't just close the gap and get locked in. Having them up on different platforms, having them in different areas of the room so the players have to find a way to get to them and close the distance, is going to also encourage your players to move around, which I keep coming back to this point, but encouraging your players to move around the room during combat is going to make it so much more fun. So having the enemies in places where they can't just be hit right away is going to do that. And the very last thing on my list is being more descriptive of fails and successes during combat. So even the little brief exchanges where it's like a small bit of damage that happens, you can either have your player like describe their attack a little more detail than just, oh, I swing my sword at him, and then it's like, oh, you hit or you miss, and then you move on. But instead of doing that, describe it just a little more. If your player rolls big and they just barely miss the AC of the enemy, like just barely, you can describe that they go to hit them with it and you think you're going to land it, and then at the last second the enemy notices you and pulls their shield up and just barely deflects it. And describe the enemy looking under their shield at the player and smiling deviously that they managed to block it, but then the enemy is actually angry that they almost got hit there, and so now their focus changes on you. But my point is just describing combat just a little bit more, describing the fails, describing the successes just a little bit more, even if they're not like critical. It's kind of like the how do you want to do this moment, but for every single attack. And it doesn't have to get crazy, and you don't have to do it for every single one, but doing it a little bit more will make your players a little more engaged and make them think a little more about how they actually do their attacks. And keeping people thinking is keeping people engaged, and that's a big point of what we're trying to do here. Okay, well, thank you all for watching this video. If you really like our content and you want to see more, please do all the things, hit the buttons, do the subscribe, the bell, all those things. And if you like my stuff specifically and you want to have a conversation with me, or you got feedback for me or other videos you would like me to make, please put it in the comments down below, because I go and read every single one, and I reply to every single one that is at least constructive. If someone's toxic, you're wasting your time, because I'm not going to reply there. But if you've got positive feedback, or you've got ideas, or you just want to like have a discussion with me, please do it, because I will talk back to you. And if you want more than that, and you want to get really engaged with our community, please join our Discord. It's free to join. We have a lot of awesome people in there, and there's so many cool ideas and concepts going on in there all the time. So much discussion, it's crazy. I have a hard time keeping up with it, but I am engaged in there, and I'm talking to people. I'm bouncing ideas off of folks about what kind of content I want to make. I'm also running some one-shots really soon, and I'm actually recruiting players from our Discord for that. So if you want to actually have a chance to play with me and see me DM, pop in the Discord and there's a chance you'll get to do that. We actually have games going all the time. We have several one-shots going. We have a few like bigger campaigns going. The GM Philosopher himself runs a few games in there. I'm actually in one of them. That's how we met, through the Discord, believe it or not. And yeah, so we're in there all the time, very live, very awesome, really cool community, and it's a great way to interact with me, the Philosopher, and also an awesome community to play D&D and, you know, talk about the greatest game in the world. So anyway, thank you so much for watching and for hanging out with me today. I'll see you all next Friday.